Interrupting this awesome content to ask you if you visited our website, collegefootballnerds.com, yet, and have you signed up for the best college football newsletter on the internet? It's the Zone Read from the College Football Nerds. We've got some of our own written content in there, as well as curated stories from around the college football world. Some interesting stats that come at you twice a week. It's about a 5-minute read. Go check it out, collegefootballnerds.com. All right, shifting gears to an actual preview, to your point that we are going to do previews. We're going to do some team previews throughout the course of July and August. And the first one, obviously, the reigning national championship team, Georgia Bulldogs, we thought we'd cover them first, give them their due. And Josh, since people have been digging into the schedule, there's been a lot of heat to Georgia. And I think part of it is people who love the sport want to see the best team play the best teams. I would argue that Georgia fans want to see their team play the best teams. And it brings me to my first point of discussion. That is the schedule, and that two things can be true at the same time. One, Georgia fans, your schedule is easy this year. It's just the truth. Two, it's not your fault. It's not Georgia's fault. And this is a drum I've beaten for a decade. Georgia, Clemson, until this year Ohio State, Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma, USC, and Notre Dame are teams that go out of their way to schedule good teams outside of their conference. I know Notre Dame doesn't play in a conference, but they schedule harder than they have to. Georgia already has a Power 5 team on their schedule in Georgia Tech. They could say, look, we got our 8+1, we're done with it. They schedule a second, intentionally making it harder for themselves to get their team involved in big games. Home and homes with Notre Dame, playing Clemson multiple times during this stretch where Clemson was in the playoffs every single year, like opened with Oregon last year. And so people want to look at this situation and make it analogous to the Michigan situation, which is not. And Michigan fans, this is the last year. Y'all get back on track next year without a conference games, so you won't hear it from me next year. Michigan canceled their series with UCLA to make sure that they had consecutive years with 8 home games. Georgia did not cancel their series with Oklahoma. The conference realignment forced Georgia to cancel. Alabama's game series with Texas is going to be finished before Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC. So this is, and to my point, that's always been, the thing I've always said is scheduling is about intent. You can't control if a team, when they finally land on your schedule, is good or not. You can't control what you were trying to do when you scheduled them. Georgia was trying to put another brand name on their schedule in Oklahoma. They weren't able to. But Josh, that doesn't mean their schedule isn't easy. So I want Georgia fans to understand that it's okay for us to point out that you have an easy schedule, because that brings up other talking points about strategy and player development that we, live in reality. But that doesn't mean we're crushing you or your team, because we have a lot of respect for what Georgia does out of conference.
I think that's a pretty good summary of the situation, right? That Georgia's schedule is pretty easy in 2023, period. It's not due to anything really within Georgia's control. Georgia cannot control the fact that Florida is down. They can't control the fact that Oklahoma ended up having to cancel because of the nature of conference realignment, and that series was going to be split over the divide when the conference got realigned. They can't control the fact that Georgia Tech sucks. I mean, they schedule in a P5 every year, and we just don't count it because they're not very good. Which, by the way, quick aside, everybody that complains about the SEC not playing 9 conference games also gives Georgia 0 credit for playing Georgia Tech, which is a P5 team and would be a conference game in the ACC. I just always have to point out, right, that everybody cares about conference games. If you're in a conference with with a 9-game conference schedule, as if every one of those is hard when they, 2 of them are Rutgers and Maryland or what have you. But if another team in another conference plays one of the weaker teams out of conference, then that doesn't count as if it's a real game. Like, it's such a screwed up, self-serving double standard. But the one thing that really matters for Georgia for our discussions this year, it's really going to be trying to nitpick them to understand how good they are. And it's the same, understand it is the same exact sort of standard and situation we've applied to Clemson in recent years. Clemson would often play 1 or 2 real games of magnitude, and we would talk about how we're going to be really critical of little nitpicky things because we're trying to evaluate how they're going to play at the end of the year. And one of the other refrains we've often said is just because you play a bad schedule does not mean you're a bad team. What we usually want to see is top teams will dominate an easy schedule start to finish. And we want to see that level of domination. First off, so we're going to be critical of anywhere where you're not dominant because it's a bad sign come playoff time. And maybe the best example of that is way back when in 2014 with Florida State that couldn't dominate what was an easy schedule. They were the reigning national title team from the year prior. They got to the playoffs and they just looked awful. And it's what everybody knew all along. They weren't a particularly good team. They just didn't come back the same way they were before. They lost pieces that they didn't quite replicate. Georgia needs to not be them over the course of the year. We're going to hold you to a very high standard relative to the teams you're playing because we know the teams you're playing aren't necessarily quite as good as what teams are going to face in the SEC West or the Big Ten East. It just is what it is. But it also doesn't mean that Georgia isn't a team that can't dominate every week. Doesn't mean they can't dominate in the playoffs. And one thing I want to note there, too, you've had a lot of people talk about strength of schedule, talk about Georgia's strength of schedule last year, and they tend to a lot of times focus on kind of getting confused between end-of-year strength of schedules and mid-season strength of schedules. What really matters is your strength of schedule come December, either before or immediately after the conference championship game. In FPI, the fourth hardest strength of schedule in the country was TCU last year. Nobody thinks TCU's regular season strength of schedule was that particularly hard compared to a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams. But they had to play Michigan, they had to play Georgia in the playoff. And when you play those two teams, when you had to play Georgia, anybody that played Georgia, their strength of schedule got really, really hard. LSU ended number 2 because of that. Georgia, who, by the way, doesn't have the ability to play Georgia, Georgia's strength of schedule to end of the year only ended up 8th. And so, to win a national title, Georgia's going to have to win the SEC championship game, a playoff game, and another playoff game, more than likely. That 3-game stretch is going to be harder than what anybody else has to face in the regular season, what anyone has to face in the regular season. So everything we talk about during the regular season is going to be really geared towards 2 points. One, is your season going to be good enough to qualify for the playoff? And then 2, if so, how is your current team going to translate when you face an Alabama or an Ohio State or a USC, which is a completely different standard of football? Michigan fans have found that out the hard way when they played Georgia a couple years ago. So I think that's where everything needs to come from. And the first point, I think, is maybe one of the more major ones when you talk about the schedule. And I'll let you talk about this, Daniel, that one of the problems for Georgia, I think, is because of the lack of high-end teams. And we may talk later in our long discussion about Tennessee and where they're going to be. The ability for Georgia to have mistakes and blemishes and make the playoff is probably going to be somewhat limited.
But yeah, I think that it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you have very slim margin for error. Like 2021 Georgia losing to Alabama and still making the playoffs, yes, it depends on what everybody else does around you, which is something you'll always hear us. That's a drum beat you'll always hear from us, is like, you can't, and this is why we say you can't compare year to year, where people are like, oh, so-and-so got in this year and we didn't get in this other year. Those are things that don't matter, because what you do in that year relative to what everybody else does is what matters. So I think that the good thing for Georgia is they'll have time to work out kinks and wrinkles against teams that are of lesser, quality that might have otherwise resulted in a loss in week 3. When you've got a new quarterback, new OC, and you're working out, new players on the defense. Those things contribute to you taking an L early in the season that might keep you out of the playoffs, because you don't have the luxury of working out these issues against a team that's not good enough to take advantage of it. But the flip side of that is, yes, I think that like Clemson in the past, who, by the way, to your point, you can be a great team with a bad schedule, they were good enough to get in deservingly anyway with that bad schedule. But you do need to be consistently dominant because you have such a slim margin for error. Josh, talk about the scenario. Texas plays Alabama. Georgia plays Alabama. If Georgia loses to Alabama in the SEC championship game and Texas loses to Alabama in the regular season, you've got a situation where one might be a Big 12 champion and one might not be a conference champion. So the same scenario happening, but because of margin for error with the regular season, it might leave Georgia out.
Yeah, and that's something I hinted at earlier when I talked about the 3 games at the end of the year. I think Georgia's path this year is going to be very difficult because I think even if they're a 12-0 team in the regular season, if they lose that SEC title game to whoever it is, LSU, Alabama, Texas A&M, they're really going to be in trouble at 12-1 if there's another 12-1 team that did win their conference championship game. And to your point with Texas, it's an interesting hypothetical, right? If Texas loses to Alabama and Georgia loses to Alabama, and they both run the table otherwise, Texas being the conference champion is probably going to get the edge over Georgia, even though Georgia's in the SEC, because again, Georgia's SEC schedule isn't that hard. And the view is going to be that Georgia played one really hard team from the SEC West. They lost that game. Texas lost two, but hey, they're a conference champion. And I think Texas jets in over Georgia. So Georgia, one of the big dangers to me, I think, is like you said, they really can't afford that 2021 scenario where they lose the conference championship game and get in. Absent the fact that, again, 2017 is always my big example. Why did Alabama get in 2017? It's because the field was junk. Most years, 2017 Alabama does not make the playoff. Shouldn't make the playoff. Probably didn't deserve to make it in 2017. But you got to put 4 teams in, and sometimes there aren't 4 deserving teams. 2017 was that case. And then so you've got the scheduling issue, and then you got the whole other issue of trying to extrapolate results and us trying to nitpick teams. To your point, I think Georgia has the advantage that there were a lot of weeks where they could have an off week and probably win the game anyway. 2018 Clemson was not a particularly good team early in the year. They played Texas A&M, won the game solidly, but didn't look overly impressive. And later on, they found Trevor Lawrence, and they had several weeks to get him up to speed before they got in the playoffs. They just weren't a great team in the first half of the year, and I don't know that they would have made it without losses had they had to play better teams. And so how do you differentiate between that team in 2018 and then somebody like 2017 Clemson, who really wasn't ever showing to be that great of a team all throughout the year? We got to the playoffs, and frankly, they just weren't that good. And I think that 2017 Clemson team flies under the radar in a lot of these discussions, that Clemson wasn't always that great. 2020 Clemson maybe was in the same boat, frankly. So, yeah, there's a lot of complications to Georgia. We probably want to get to X's and O's and players a little bit, but, sort of frame the whole discussion, because at the end of the day, Georgia is probably going to be a lot better than the competition. They're probably going to win minimum of 11 games this year, I think, in the between the just in the regular season. And a lot of what we're talking about with Georgia is going to be geared solely towards the playoff and not even really discussing how much they're going to be challenged in the regular season, just given their overall talent level.
It will be interesting to see the opportunity for player development. And I think that we're feeling a little bit of this with Georgia, at least in the national media, or maybe I'm just too much on Twitter and in the fan sphere, but Georgia is getting the same treatment that Alabama gets now and has gotten for the last decade plus, in that when Georgia has either personnel exit, either coaches or players exit that were critical to their success, people feel like, okay, now is when they have to rebuild, or now is when they're going to really feel those exits. But Josh, Georgia is at a point right now in terms of recruiting and development and overall personnel and just their system that they are reloading. So even when you've got a quarterback that, led you to 2 national championships leave, or an offensive coordinator leave, like, they've got so much on cruise control in a good way that even if they had a tough schedule this year, I'm not inclined to think that they lose more than one game, just because I think that they are in that same, stratosphere as Alabama has been, in terms of, like, you tell us every year we're going to need to rebuild, but we're actually reloading, and then that's when we win a national championship. I think that's what we're going to see. That's what Georgia's saying the same thing, is we're going to win a national championship anyway, because those guys are just as hungry, and it's now just their turn, and we're just that stacked as a system and in our personnel.
Yeah, and the interesting thing there with Georgia is they were so much better than everyone else last year, and for most of the season, maybe outside an Alabama team that was peaking at one point, really all through 2021, Georgia can take a step or two back and still win the national title. And I know that was our refrain last year, right? That Georgia, our point was, we don't think Georgia is going to be as good as they were in 2021. And I'm actually not sure that they were, but that it really may not matter, because they were so much better than everyone else, and we expected most everyone else to take a step back. that you could still win all your games. I think that was probably somewhat true. I don't know. There was no 2020 Alabama last year. There was no, even Ohio State, they were really good, but they still really weren't a complete, consistent team on both sides of the football. And they pushed Georgia really hard in that game. And maybe a better Ohio State team is able to beat Georgia, right? It wouldn't have taken a whole lot, but they had too many kinks in that football team. They still weren't really a complete team. They weren't really complete on both sides of the line of scrimmage in the way they needed to be to handle Georgia. So, yeah, I mean, Georgia's in a perfect position to rebuild. And to talk a little bit about personnel, I mean, there are a lot of key pieces that are returning. There are a lot of pieces that were rotational part of the team that I think are going to be more important this year. They were an efficiency machine par excellence last year. We talked a lot about their ability to sustain drives, was something we almost have never seen before. I want to say they were third in the country in points per drive. One of the most underrated stats, in my opinion, in college football was the ability the last 2 years for Georgia to score a lot of points relative to the amount of possessions they had. The scores weren't really high because they didn't try to score quickly, and because their defense kind of ground other teams down, and given how much they ran the ball, the games were just kind of shorter. But in terms of points per possession, they were actually just as good or better than a lot of other teams. Like, they were right up there with Alabama last year, when Alabama was playing good football. And that kind of before Alabama fell off a cliff, we were even noting, Georgia's really not behind any of these teams. They're not really behind Ohio State on the offensive side of the ball. And that was really built around guys like Rosemy-Jacksain and McConkey and Arian Smith, Brock Bowers, Washington. All that depth really combined to form a team that had a lot of really good options. The running back core is really deep. And I would say really across the board with Georgia offensively, my opinion for a little while now has been, I don't know that there's a Todd Gurley or a Nick Chubb on this football team, somebody that's a surefire carry the team at an NFL level guy, but there are a lot of guys that are quality starters at an NFL level. And when you have that many options in college, it really changes the way teams have to defend you, because most teams, as we say a lot, they don't really have a high-level third or especially fourth corner on the team. They don't really have enough linebackers to be able to cover multiple tight ends at a high level. They usually have one or two guys that are really good, and they may have a good unit. But at some level, teams usually have a pretty bad drop-off in their depth at every position. And if you've got that many high-quality guys, Georgia can line up in whatever kind of set they want to do and expose you. The Oregon game in particular to start the year, I thought was a great example of that, because I don't think Oregon's secondary was very deep. And Georgia just went, we're going to spread you wide. We're going to dump the ball off to a high-level player, and we're going to watch him hurdle or run over you for 15 yards every play, because we don't think your guys can line up man-on-man. We'll find the good matchup, and we'll just destroy you. They did the same thing to TCU, I think, at the championship game. So that's there. But I think the questions start to arise on how much of a step back you're going to take from an efficiency perspective, and how much of a step back you may or may not take from the defensive side of the ball. And if you do take that step back, how much of a step back are you going to have to take before you get to the point where people actually can beat you? Where your off day like you had against Missouri, does that become a loss instead of a close win? And those are the games where I think you start to nitpick Georgia, because they are an excellent team, and I want to reinforce, an excellent team with clearly one of the top three teams in the country in terms of talent. Them, Ohio State, and Alabama are on a different level than everybody else. But we're really just evaluating them on, are you going to lose a game? And these little nitpicky questions, I think, start to determine that answer.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia fans, I guess they've been here a couple of years, but welcome to where Alabama and Clemson fans have felt a little bit alienated from us recently, in that when you get so good, the good is baked in, and we really try to find where you could possibly be beaten, and it comes off a little negative where it's not. I'm glad you worked Oregon in there too, because when we're talking about the schedule situation for Georgia opened the season with a team that won 10 games last year, 10 or 11 games last year in Oregon, I think, beat them so badly that Georgia literally got no credit for that win. I remember arguing with people all year last year who were like, Georgia hasn't played anybody. Georgia, because they beat them so bad, the game was completely discredited. Like, the win was completely omitted from people's minds. Like, if Georgia wins that game 27-23, They're like, oh man, Georgia, got a good win against a good team. Because Georgia was so much better than everybody else, and nobody's beaten Oregon that bad. Georgia got no credit for it, when in reality, it was a confirmed result. It was a result that informed on how good Georgia was, in spite of how good Oregon also was. So I thought that was really funny last year. So it's like Georgia could beat Oklahoma this year 43-2, and Oklahoma win 10 games, 9-10 games, and Georgia wouldn't get credit for it anyway. So one of the things that I do want to talk about in terms of what I thought was a key to Georgia's efficiency monster status for the last couple of years was how good of a fit Monken and Bennett were, and how great Monken was at either his system or just a wizard at tailoring what he could to his personnel. In your opinion, because everybody's focusing on Carson Beck and Bennett leaving and all that experience walking out the door, and an unproven quarterback coming in this year, in your opinion, which is the bigger potential speed bump for Georgia? The new quarterback or the new OC?
Am I allowed to cheat and say you can't really decouple the two?
You can, I guess. You always do. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess if you force me to give an answer, I'd probably say the quarterback, because at the end of the day, the quarterback's the one handling the ball, right? But I think there was such a strong marriage between what they were able to get from the OC and the quarterback position in unison last year that it just worked perfectly. We were on the Stetson Bennett bandwagon way ahead of everybody else.
Before Georgia fans.
I'm gonna do victory laps on that for a long time. In 2020, even, we were really out there saying, look, Bennett's playing good football. He got a shoulder hurt in that Florida game, and I think he doesn't have the physical tools to play with this sort of shoulder injury or something like that at any sort of high level. The guy's at his best when he's a quick release efficiency machine. And last year and the year prior, he was clearly a 5th and 6th year player that understood college football at a level nobody else did. I mean, the fun stat I have is that Stetson Bennett is older than Jalen Hurts. I mean, he's been playing football a long time, and he was the equivalent of like a third-year NFL guy that was still playing college, and you could tell. And when you combine that with Monken's scheme, which let them really just tailor the offense to his strengths, move the quarterback around a lot. They had a lot of high-efficiency throws, a lot of quick throws from 5 to 15 yards, with an ability to get really schematically, get guys open, get the ball out fast, get a completion, and they move the ball down the field like clockwork. And they had a lot of high-end statistics, high-end yard per attempt number. Maybe you can, I don't know if you can find that off the fly, but I don't have it in front of me. For a team that didn't bomb the ball down the field a ton. And usually when you see guys that are throwing for like 12 yards per attempt or 10 yards per attempt, they're Joe Burrow throwing to Chase for 60-yard bombs on a regular basis, or
I've got the number.
Alabama with Tagovailoa. What do you have it in front of you? What was
Stetson Bennett finished 5th in the nation in yards per attempt, tied with Caleb Williams, and he was so Hendon Hooker and C.J. Stroud were the only 2 Power 5 quarterbacks that had a higher yard per attempt average than Stetson Bennett.
And the quarterbacks you're talking about there were throwing bombs all year, right? Hendon Hooker was constantly throwing deep shots. So, of course, his yard per attempt number is going to be kind of high. For Bennett to be at that level without taking those shots means that he's completing an obscene amount of his passes at 10 to 15 yards. And that's what made Georgia the machine they were. So I think now that you move out of that scheme, so one, you probably are going to lose a little bit in terms of constantly having an open guy and constantly having that read. But even without it, even if you still had him, I don't know that you get the same result, because you don't have the quarterback in his sixth year of the system that always knew where to look and throw the football. And it's seamless, and people don't understand it, and you don't see it. But it is a special thing for a quarterback to drop back and know where he's supposed to be throwing every play. And it makes it look so much easier than it actually is. And I will say, I watched the spring game with Carson Beck and Vandegrift. One, I felt like Beck clearly to me looks a couple steps ahead of Vandegrift right now. He's just developmentally further ahead. But what you see from Beck is a much more prototypical passer. He's taller. He's not as mobile as Bennett. Bennett was way underrated for his just overall quickness in the pocket. I don't know what his 40 time is compared to his shuttle, but the thing that made Bennett special was his short area quickness. He could burst out of the pocket around a D end or a linebacker, was really hard to take down. And he had an ability because of that to constantly take plays that should be negative plays and turn them into positive plays. Constantly finding a way to get 6 yards or 7 yards when it should be a sack or a throwaway.
Which makes it hard to get them off the field, which is the key to the efficiency monster.
Right. And the thing with Beck is I think you're going to see more of a vertical passing game. He can step his foot down and drive better than Bennett for sure, can put more velocity on the ball. And when he's on time and rhythm throwing to his primary reads, he looks really good. I think the issues that we're going to have to nitpick on are what happens when the pocket breaks down a little bit. What happens when he can't throw on rhythm and on time. Same issues that we nitpicked on C.J. Stroud, because I think in a lot of ways Beck and maybe Vandegrift too are more similar players to Stroud than they were Bennett. And the problem for guys like that usually start to crop up only when they're in adverse circumstances. So he's probably going to... Beck may light people up that are inferior teams in a way that Bennett didn't, and he may struggle against better teams in a way that Bennett never did in his last 2 years. And it's going to come down to his understanding of the offense, but I think especially it's going to come down to the time it takes for him to release the ball, his ability to escape the pocket, his ability to make good decisions in the face of pressure. I know Bennett wasn't perfect, but he was a lot better than he ever got credit for. And those are all things that, right now are just hypotheticals. So I'm saying those are the things I'm going to be looking for over the course of the year, things I'm going to be nitpicking, because those things are going to really determine how Georgia from that 12-game schedule turns into a playoff team. And they've got a lot of time to fine-tune Beck or Vandegrift, whoever the starter is, and work out those kinks. But we need to see them worked out over the course of the year, because the way they work as passers, the way the offense I think is going to function is a more pro-style offense, which is going to be more dependent upon being able to run the ball to open up the pass. That stuff is much more affected when you play high-level defenses and you end up in a shootout. That's when you have more of a tendency to start to stall, more of a tendency to create negative plays. So I think the ability for Georgia to consistently score tons of points and move the football consistently against no matter who they play, probably going to fall off a little bit. I think the ceiling is going to be higher against worse competition. I think the floor may be a little bit lower. And then trying to figure out where they land in those two things is going to be really the challenge on the offensive side of the ball.
And I have looked, and I know you looked too, I couldn't see any definitive statements on Ra Thomas and his availability, but I think that there's huge upside to having a quarterback coming in fresh, and you've got a lot of experience with Ladd McConkey. You've got Brock Bowers coming back, which, just as a quick aside, I know we got to wrap Georgia up, but Josh, is it wild to you that he's still playing college football? Because I tweeted a question that did a pretty good amount of numbers on give me a player who, going back from all of college football eternity, back to the beginning, give me a player who you thought day one, game one, true freshman, was the most NFL ready. And Brock Bowers was the number one response we got. Is it kind of weird that he's still going to be walking around a college campus?
It does feel odd, and it's because Brock Bowers as a junior has played more football than a lot of people have, once they finish their career, right? I mean, he's played tons of snaps and been the focus since day one as a freshman, and it's a rare thing. There aren't that many guys that get focused on like that. You look around the conference, there have been players that played at a high level and they were that dominant. You look at guys like Kyle Pitts at Florida, really dominant, wasn't playing that much as a true freshman. I think maybe the exceptions, there have been a couple Alabama receivers as freshmen that came on strong, but even those guys didn't really play a ton until maybe halfway through their freshman year. So, it is weird, and I think it's a testament to how good he is, but it's also one of those weird deals in college football that if you have a player that's that good, they can carry you a long time. And let me give one parallel. I've often argued that the Clemson championships from 2016 through 2018 were on the back of one defensive line class or one group of defensive linemen, right? And I know you've heard this argument from me several times that if you look at that Lawrence Wilkins line, they got about 5 guys in that rotation that were all first and second round draft picks. it was probably a generational set of defensive talent that all came in 1 or 2 years, and a lot of them returned as seniors in 2018. And when you have guys like that can come in and make impacts as freshmen, and they stay 3 or 4 years and play the whole time, you almost end up with an entire era of dominance as a football team, because you get basically over the course of 3 or 4 years, you get the kind of production that most teams only get for a year or two out of a high level player, because of the time it takes for them to develop and go to pro early. So I think Brock Bowers in that tight end room, I won't say it's quite as impactful as a D line can be, like that Clemson group, but I think there's some similarities there offensively for Georgia, and how in the fact that for an entire era of Georgia football, that tight end group has basically solidified the entire offense.
All right, let's close out Georgia. You know, when we do these kind of previews or summer discussions about a team before we see them, we don't pick their ultimate season, what they're going to do at the end of the year, that sort of thing. But I do think it's interesting to just regular season over under 11 wins. Let's say 11 and a half wins regular season. Are you taking under or over?
Over. I think they're more likely to go 12-0 than 11-1.
Okay. I'm going to go under. So you're over. I'm going to go under. I think they're going to lose. I think they're going to lose a game in the regular season, which, by the way, if that's the case, it's literally better for Georgia if they lose to Ole Miss than if they lose to Alabama or LSU or Texas A&M in the SEC championship game. It sounds worse, but it's literally better. I'm going to go under by half a game.
Yeah, there's an irony here, which is that I'm not sure that a loss in the regular season actually matters for Georgia, because I think they almost have to win the SEC championship game. So if you lose in the regular season, win the SEC championship game, you're going to go to the playoff anyway. So I don't know that matters. And the point we often make statistically, right, is if you have a 90% chance to win every game during the season, you are very likely to lose one game. I said over, but the reality is you're always safer picking a team to lose. It's very, very hard to go undefeated. It takes a lot of injury luck. It takes a lot of luck in not having a bad game versus a team on a good game, not playing in a hurricane, not a million other things. And I think Georgia's been down this road enough, 2012, 2018, right, where they were right on the cusp of things to know there are a lot of factors outside your control. It has a lot to do with what other teams you play that peak at the right time. And so it takes a lot of luck to go undefeated, and it takes a lot of luck to win a championship, even for the best teams.